Howdy. Thought it might be fun to, now that I have my records out and arranged and easily accessible, to talk about some of them in a sort of exciting and improvisational way. So Discogs.com is a website app that allows you to catalog and track your record collection as well as buy and sell records. It's the biggest record database and record like sales platform, except for maybe eBay, on the internet. And when you go and look at your collection, there's a little feature that they added a couple years ago that I think is really fun, where you can just have it pick a random record from your collection, which is really fun for if you're just sort of like, I don't know what to listen to. You can have it just sort of shuffle your whole collection, pick one at random, and then you can go grab it and throw it on. It's a good way to get you to listen to stuff that maybe you haven't listened to in a while or forgotten that you had, if you have a bigger collection like me. So I thought maybe I'd just do that a few times, see what we get, talk about some albums. I don't know how long this will end up being or how many albums I'll do, but we'll just go and see what happens. Pink by Boris. This big fat pink box. This record originally came out in 2005, and it was the first Boris record that I ever heard. Some of their earlier albums nowadays are held in higher regard than this one is. Albums like Feedbacker and Akuma no Yuta are considered among their best, but I really love this album too. This is a reissue from 2016, so like for the 10th anniversary of the album. I first heard it when it first came out when I was in high school. 2006 I think is when it came out in America. When I was a sophomore in high school, 10th grade. And this is an interesting one. So Boris are known as a sort of experimental metal band, which is maybe a little reductive. They do heavy music of all sorts of genres. They've done drone, noise, hard rock, metal, just run the gamut, really. And on this record, they're doing a lot of different styles and things that are really interesting. The listed genres on Rate Your Music are stoner rock, hard rock, sludge metal, doom metal, and drone. And I think that kind of pretty much encapsulates it. This one has a lot more of a sort of like hard rock, almost like Motorhead type of metal influence than their previous albums did, particularly on tracks like the title track, Pink. I think this is a good like entry point for Boris too, because of that sort of Motorhead sound. I think it's a lot more accessible than some of their earlier stuff that's more in the sort of drone and doom and more experimental vein. This is a triple LP here, deluxe edition. It's got the album on 2 records and then a third bonus disc of session outtakes from the recording sessions for the album. This was put out by Sargent House, the very, very good experimental metal label. It's a little weird to open. You see it kind of has this little tab, and then it just kind of folds apart, and then we've got the records on the inside here. They're just black, no special colors or anything. So yeah, it's easy to find it on the shelf because it's big and fat and pink. Another artist that starts with a B from around the same period of time. This one came out in 2007. It's Untrue by Burial, the second of Burial's 2 LPs. So he made an album just before this that was self-titled, and then this one, Untrue, which is, both are very acclaimed, this one slightly more so. And Burial was sort of at the forefront of the dubstep movement, and in popular American culture, dubstep is associated with people like Skrillex, but that genre of music is a sort of offshoot of dubstep that music critics or profilers or musicologists have termed bro step. Dubstep is something that started a number of years before and came out of the UK electronic scene with, jungle garage that grew out of house and things like that. Started in the early 2000s. And this record is often, generally considered to be the best example of dubstep in its, original form. Very haunting, scattershot sound, really sort of like sketchy, awkward sounding drums, and samples of R&B music that has been modulated and reverbed to give it this really ethereal and echoey sound. Like, I know that the first proper track on this, Archangel, which is one of his most popular songs, is actually built around a sample of the theme from Metal Gear Solid 2, which is pretty sweet. This is an amazing record. Came out when I was in high school, like I said, 2007. November 2007, so that would have been when I was a senior, grade 12. And yeah, I've always loved this album, but it kind of has grown on me even more over the years. In the last, definitely in the last 10 years, but particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, I've gotten a lot more into electronic music, more intensely, and this is just, an absolute, stone cold classic of electronic music. If you have even a passing interest in electronic music, I think that this is absolutely a record that is worth your time and worth checking out. Yeah. Next, we've got another Stone Cold classic. It's Yip Jump Music by the late great Daniel Johnston. Man, it was really a tough, bitter pill when we lost Dan. Just about 2 years ago, he passed away. So this was Dan's 5th record. He made a lot of albums in the first half of the 1980s that were all recorded on boomboxes in his garage. He was one of the earliest pioneers of home recorded music. Not the first, certainly, but one of the first to have a moderate amount of success doing it. And of his, he had, let me see here, 5, 6, 7. He had 8 albums in this early boombox era from 81 to 85. And the 2 most well-known and loved are this one and its follow-up, Hi, How Are You? So Dan Johnston, singer-songwriter, he's generally doing either acoustic guitar, piano, or organ, chord organ, with him singing. Just a great American songwriter tradition. He is known for his work, his life, and as one of so people talk about outsider music, outsider art, people who are making art outside of the traditional structures and confines of the systems that are in place to produce and distribute art. And so Dan was doing home recording, self-distributing tapes, playing in the Austin area and becoming popular. And then he became even more popular when he was featured on MTV, when MTV was doing coverage of South by Southwest in the mid-'80s. But then shortly thereafter, he sort of developed pretty severe mental health problems, some pretty severe bipolar disorder that would frequently cause him to have manic episodes of psychosis and hallucination. And he was repeatedly hospitalized, and then he started gaining a lot of weight, and he was never able to really get his life back under control fully, it seems. And he spent the second half of his life, basically from the 90s onward, living next door to his parents so that they could care for him and keep an eye on him and make sure that he was doing well. And in the last 10 years of his life or so, he didn't record much. He started getting tremors, and he couldn't play the guitar anymore. Performing was really hard for him because of his health. And it's just, kind of a pretty sad story. He was a pretty sad dude who had a pretty sad life. There's a documentary about him that came out in the mid-2000s called The Devil and Daniel Johnston. That's one of the best music documentaries ever made, I think, that will tell you everything you need to know about him and expose you to a lot of his music, which is all very beautiful. He had another resurgence in the 90s because Kurt Cobain wore a t-shirt with the cover of Hi, How Are You on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. And in journals, there was Cobain's list of his 50 favorite albums, and this one is on that list. It's not my favorite Dan Johnston album. It's probably my third favorite. But it is incredibly good. It's got some of his, most enduring songs on it, actually. Speeding Motorcycle is one of his biggest songs. Casper the Friendly Ghost. Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Your Grievances, another one of his really enduring and popular songs, frequently covered. Speeding Motorcycle, another frequently... Yo La Tengo did a really great version of Speeding Motorcycle. I know. This one also has King Kong on it, which Tom Waits did a cover of for the Daniel Johnston tribute album that came out in the 2000s, and then that cover is also on Orphans, his triple album that he did in the late 2000s. If you are into, sad singer-songwriter music, outsider art, you will not go wrong with this record or any of Daniel Johnston's other records, particularly Hi, How Are You is amazing, and I also really like his album 1990 that he recorded for Shimmy Disc Records with Mark Kramer. right after he got out of the hospital for having like really intense hallucinations, where he was convinced that he was very religious and apocalyptic visions that heavily inspired that album. So yeah, great stuff.
Don't let the sun go down on your grievance. Respect love of the heart over lust of the flesh. Do yourself a favor, become your own savior, and don't let the sun go down on your grievance.
Next, I actually talked about this in a previous video, in the MU Core video that I did. It's Spiderland by Slint, the second of two albums by Louisville, Kentucky's own Slint. This one came out in 1991, and was one of the pivotal releases in defining the sound that has come to be known as post-rock, also math rock, all these things coming out of like the world of post-punk from the 80s, that were really influential on like 90s Midwest emo bands, as well as bands like Godspeed You Black Emperor, even. It's 6 long songs that are haunting and complex and very intense. And they were originally written as instrumentals, but in the studio, Brian McMahon, who is the guitar player, one of the guitar players in the band, he did most of the vocals for this record, but he sort of wrote and recorded them very quickly, off the cuff, in the studio. They had been rehearsing the songs for a long time without any vocals. And right after they finished recording, he ended up having to go to hospital, as I say, for mental health problems. And so the fact that he was like on the verge, of that happening, comes across pretty clearly in the rawness of the lyrics, as well as the performance, particularly on the album's most famous song, its closer, Good Morning Captain, which climaxes with him just shrieking his fucking heart out, in this very haunting performance. And these dudes were all like 19 years old when they made this album, just insanely young. And then, so Dave Pajo, over here, he went on to be a guitar player for a number of popular indie rock bands over the years, including Tortoise, and then he was in Zwan, the Billy Corgan project that he had during the years that Smashing Pumpkins wasn't a thing, and he was a touring guitarist for Yeahs, and he played with Interpol for a while. He's been, and he has a solo projects as well. So he's had the most storied career after Slint. The other guys behind Slint didn't do much after Slint. Britt Walford, who was kind of the leader, maybe not the right word. The way that it's sort of represented in the documentary Breadcrumb Trail about Slint is that he was sort of the main creative force behind the band, the one that kind of kept everything going and kept everything together. He would, after this record and Slint broke up before the album came out, they never toured for it or anything like that. He would become the drummer for the Breeders for a while, and it was at a time when the Breeders was supposed to be an all-girl band, so he would have to perform in drag so that nobody knew that he was not a woman. And then he made one album with a project in the early 2000s called The Four Carnation, which was not dissimilar from Slint, kind of stylistically, very sad post-rock music. And Slint has had a couple of short, like, one-off reunions in the last, like, 15 years or so, but that's pretty much it. This was the definitive piece. Their first album is entirely instrumental, and it's not bad, but it's pretty okay, I would say. And that's pretty much, I think most people really agree that album is, like, okay, and then this one is, like, one of the best albums ever made. I cannot recommend this one strongly enough. This one would be in my, like, personal top 50 of all time list, which the previous albums I've talked about are all very good, but they are not in that list. This one is, so this is the real deal. Next, it's my favorite album from the band with the most annoying guy in the world in it. It's Hatful of Hollow by the Smiths. Smiths fans may immediately be balking at me saying this is my favorite album because it's not an album. It's a compilation. This is a compilation of singles and B-sides and, like, Peel sessions, radio sessions of earlier songs from their earlier albums, like This Charming Man and, things like that. But it's still my favorite. I don't care. It's got some of the Smiths' best known and best, just in general, songs. Like, it's got it's got How Soon Is Now on it, which is probably, like, the most famous Smiths song. It was famously, a cover of it was used as the theme song to the TV show Charmed in the 90s. But it's also got, Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now, which is one of their most famous songs. Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want, another very famous song. William, It Was Really Nothing, maybe not like that, like most popular, but I really love that song. There's a lot that you can say about Morrissey. He's a pretty insufferable guy. I don't blame Johnny Marr for turning down insane amounts of money that he's been offered to reunite the Smiths solely because he's never wants to interact with Morrissey ever again. Makes sense to me. Morrissey just seems like incapable of ever saying anything that isn't completely stupid and doing anything that doesn't make him seem like a complete and utter asshole. But he's talented, and especially in the Smiths era, where he presented this sort of facade, this public persona that also came through in his lyrics of this sort of, like, bisexual incel wayfish ferryman, where, like, he was very gay but also very straight at the same time, and he just, like, exuded sexuality but also, like, wouldn't have sex with anyone, but it seemed to, like, make him miserable that he chose to do that. Very weird sort of persona. and he's a very literary dude. He's making a lot of, like Cemetery Gates on Queen is Dead. He's talking about Keats and Yeats and Oscar Wilde and all those guys, and he's always very depressed and morose. But the real like driving, winning force of the Smiths is Johnny Marr and his music. Johnny Marr wrote all of the music for the Smiths, and Morrissey wrote the lyrics and sang. And Morrissey did, decent things after the Smiths ended, but, I really think that there was something about those two guys, despite the fact that they hate each other, when they came together, they really did some magical shit. Maybe people might argue with me that Queen is Dead is, the definitive Smiths album. But I think this one is a good intro. It's got some of their biggest hits on it, which I think makes it more accessible. And it's just a really solid record. Can't say much bad about it.
Good times for a change. See, the luck I've had can make a good man turn bad. So please, 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 let me get what I want this time.
Next, we've got Joe's Garage by Frank Zappa. This one's credited just to Frank Zappa, not the Mothers. And I grabbed Act 1, but when I rolled the dice, it gave me 2 and 3. So this is a triple album that was released in 2 separate releases. He released Act 1 as a standalone single LP, and then released Acts 2 and 3 as a gatefold double LP. But it's one album, and on like CD reissues, it's a two CD single thing. It's just 2 separate releases for vinyl, for whatever reason. And so this is like Zappa's big, epic 2-hour rock opera about a lot of things. This is from 1979 that this guy came out. And it tells a story of, a guy named Joe, who, as a teenager, he just wants to be in a rock and roll band and, play the same old song over and over again and get drunk and whatever. And then he sort of goes on this, quest to kind of discover himself. Various things happen. There's a lot of satire about like the rock and roll lifestyle, and then he gets into a point where he is indoctrinated into this cult that's a parody of Scientology, that is the Church of Appliantology, which is all people who want to have sex with robots. And there's a love song that's about him getting a blowjob from a robot. And then he gets an STI, and then eventually they make music illegal, and he has to go to prison, but then he goes crazy because he can't rock out, and then there's like these like 3 like 10-minute long guitar solos that are like inside of his brain while he works at like the muffin factory. It's very Frank Zappa, if you can't tell. And it's one of the most explicitly, like, comedic things that Zappa ever did. It's the most explicitly narrative thing that he ever did, too. And the first volume, the first act, is a lot more sort of conventional and humorous. And then once we get into the second and third volumes, that's when we start getting the like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 minute songs and he was using this method that he pioneered, that he had a name for that I can't remember off the top of my head, where basically he would be playing, they would record their live shows, and he would do, these extended improvised guitar solos and jams, and he would basically like record these improvised solos and then isolate the guitar and then like paste it into studio recordings of songs to like create this sort of like mixture of studio written and live improvisational. Very interesting. So I think, this was really like the first Zappa album that like I really got into. I think it's pretty accessible because it's so funny and silly, but also shows off, how talented and virtuistic he is as a musician. It's not my favorite Zappa by like any stretch of the imagination at this point. It might, I don't even think it's top 5, but I always have a special place in my heart for it because it was kind of the entryway for me into his stuff. His 70s stuff was a lot more accessible and rock and like big classic rock sounding stuff, and a lot more humorous and like joke oriented, I guess. Whereas his 60s stuff was a lot more sort of like psychedelic and experimental, and then his like 80s and onward stuff was when he started doing more like jazz and modern classical and things like that, and when he started making all those Synclavier records, which were all, everything he ever did was awesome. But yeah, Joe's Garage, good shit. This one's got some good. It's got Catholic Girls, and Wet T-Shirt Night, the classic wet T-shirt contest song, at the Brasserie, home of the tits. I first heard this record when I was like 13, and so it definitely appealed to my 13-year-old, sophomoric sense of humor.
Welcome to the first church of Appliantology. The white zone is for loading and unloading only.
Don't you be terrified. It's just a token of my extreme. Don't you be terrified. It's just a token of my extreme. Don't you never try to look behind my eyes. You don't want to know what they have seen.
Alright, next we have from 1988, the fourth album by Texas's own Butthole Surfers. This is Hairway to Steven. Of course, a riff on Stairway to Heaven. So, Butthole Surfers were a band, a psychedelic and experimental rock band from Texas that started in the early 80s. They were a huge influence and scene around their stuff in the 80s. Legendary underground band that influenced a ton of people with their sort of psychedelic and experimental sound, as well as their very unique and high energy live shows. You can see a lot of direct analogs with like early Flaming Lips. Clearly really liked these guys, and the theatricality and over-the-topness of the Flaming Lips live show, I think, is probably indebted to them as well. So this is, generally when people talk about Butthole Surfers, they usually just talk about Locust Abortion Technician, which is the album that immediately preceded this, the year before, in 1987. Or they talk about Electric Larryland, their second major label album from 1996, which featured the breakout modern rock hit Pepper, where it was like this insane, how is this possible happenstance where 15 years after they started on their like 7th record, the Butthole Surfers, a band with a name that David Letterman wasn't allowed to say on television when they performed, had a huge hit song to the point where like you could consider them a one-hit wonder band if they didn't have all of this, 15 years of context before that song came out that, cemented them as these underground legends. This album is very good. I think pretty much everything that they did in the 80s is very good. Once the 90s rolled around, they started getting more sort of pop and bland, I guess. And like, Pepper's a good song, and Electric Larryland has good stuff on it, but it's not nearly as interesting as listening to something like this or their even earlier stuff. This was kind of the last really good thing that they did, in my opinion. I think that Locust Abortion Technician is going to be a better place to start for them if you've never listened to them before or have only listened to like Pepper. You might be pretty surprised by what you hear. But this is still a great record, and I'm happy I own it.
10 foot tall and the nurse stuck a needle in my arm. Well, Uncle Doc's nurse used a needle with ungodly charm. Whoa, 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 whoa. Walking down the hall, the dentist loomed through the door. I saw an X-ray of a girl passing down. The one-shot theory got us weary, things got rolling and loud. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Next, we have an obscure album that sold very few copies from a small independent band that no one has ever heard of. It's Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. Obviously, that was a joke. This is like one of the best-selling albums of all time, and one of the most famous albums of all time, one of the most acclaimed albums of all time, maybe the most famous album cover of all time. If you've never heard this album before, I am impressed, honestly, that you've gotten this far in life without hearing it. And I'm a little jealous because it's pretty good, maybe a little overhyped, but very good nonetheless. It's not my favorite Floyd album by maybe it's top 5. I'd say that Animals is maybe the best, and I do have a soft spot in my heart for Piper at the Gates of Dawn, their debut with Syd Barrett, and Wish You Were Here is better than this album too. But then maybe this one after that. Maybe Metal. I don't know. Pink Floyd is really good. It's a pretty cold take, but Pink Floyd is really good. And prog is not my mostest favoritist thing, but I think that Roger Waters is really incredibly talented. This record is from before Roger Waters fully asserted his big dick energy on the band and took over completely. what is there to say about this record, right? It's just like, it's ubiquitous, it's inescapable, it is a titan of popular music, and deservedly so.
Taking away the moments that make up a dull day. Fritter and waste the hours in an offhand way. Picking around on a piece of ground in your hometown. Waiting for someone or something to show you the way.
I know I made that really dumb joke about Pink Floyd being like an obscure independent band, but this time I have an actual really obscure and independent band that nobody has probably ever heard of. It's the Beatles, with Meet the Beatles. You can see right here, it's the first album by England's phenomenal pop combo. And so, the story of this album requires a sort of little bit of an explanation of the early Beatles catalog, where the albums that the Beatles recorded and released as albums, which they intended to be albums, were not released as albums in America. They were chopped up and rearranged and recompiled and given new names and all sorts of shit. Up through, they did release Rubber Soul and Revolver in America, but with heavily altered track lists that featured singles songs on them and cut other songs, and then some of the cut songs wound up on Yesterday and Today, which was not an album in the UK. Anyways, all of that is to say that this is the first album by the Beatles in America, but it is, Please Please Me is the actual first album by the Beatles. And so, typical, track list here that you would expect for the first album of the Beatles. You've got I Want to Hold Your Hand, I Saw Her Standing There, All My Loving, Don't Bother Me, Hold Me Tight, I Want to Be Your Man. It's pretty hard to deny that these are great songs, Personally, I'm I'm a bigger fan of their later stuff. I think most people are. I think that probably like Revolver and Rubber Soul are their best. That mid-era is their best stuff. Like maybe in my heart of hearts, like I like the White Album and Abbey Road more, but both of those albums also have a few songs on them that just straight up like fucking suck ass. Like Maxwell's Silver Hammer, that song can die in a pit of fire as far as I'm concerned. Just fucking awful. Exemplary of everything I hate about Paul McCartney, that song. But, this is a solid... It's none of the songs on this are as good as fucking Love Me Do. That's the best early Beatles song, and I'll fight you if you disagree with me. But there's still some solid tracks on here, so... And as you can see, I purchased this for $1.99. I got it at a record fair in maybe like 2004 or 5, something like that. I remember at that same record fair, also for $1.99, I got My Life in the Bush of Ghosts by David Byrne and Brian Eno, and Computer World by Kraftwerk, both of which are better albums than this one. Alright, next we've got one that people probably don't know much about, but it's really good. It's Mr. Heartbreak by Laurie Anderson. This is from 1984. This was Laurie Anderson's second record. after her debut, Big Science, that had the breakout surprise success single of Oh Superman on it, one of the greatest songs ever recorded, in my opinion, Oh Superman. And so 2 years later, she followed it up with Mr. Heartbreak, which, is generally considered to be a bit more pop and mainstream. One of the more pop and mainstream things that she ever did. She had her feet pretty firmly rooted in the world of avant-garde and experimental and modern classical and electronic music. And it was kind of always just a freak accident, I think, that she broke into the mainstream in the way she did, to the limited degree that she did. And so this album has contributions from people like Adrian Below, famed virtuosistic guitarist who played with bands like King Crimson and the Talking Heads. William S. Burroughs, the author, does some spoken word on here. Peter Gabriel, you know who Peter Gabriel is. Nile Rodgers, of the band Chic, a famous guitarist, one of the pioneering and most important people to the evolution of the sound of disco music. He had a bit of a resurgence earlier in the 2010s when he was featured heavily on the Daft Punk album Random Access Memories, and particularly on the song Get Lucky with Pharrell. This features the opening track Sharky's Day, which is one of Laurie Anderson's most popular songs. Had a pretty popular music video that was, got a lot of airplay on MTV. It also has the song Excellent Birds, which is a collaboration between her and Peter Gabriel that Peter Gabriel sings lead vocals on, and a alternate version of the song Excellent Birds was entitled This Is the Picture, and then Excellent Birds in parentheses was included on his album So, his most famous and best album from 2 years after this, 1986. And then, of course, we also have Sharky's Night, the outro album that features an extended spoken word narration from William S. Burroughs. I do think that Big Science is a better album than this. It's probably a better place to start, too. Laurie Anderson is just such an awesome person, such a cool person. She invented a number of very cool musical instruments, including the electric tape-o violin, which was a violin that had tape heads built into it, and then she would craft violin bows that were, instead of strung with horsehair, they were strung with magnetic tape that she could then play and back and forth and craft songs out of that. And she had a number of other really cool things that she created. She's just a really smart and intelligent woman who was also lucky enough to get to tame the wild beast that was Lou Reed and spend the last 25 years of his life with him, which is pretty sweet as well. Yeah.
Sun's coming up like a big bald head bulging up over the grocery store.
Next we have the least popular and least liked album by a very important and influential band. It's Family Man by Black Flag from 1984. So, Black Flag had a really weird progression for their career, where they existed for many years without recording a record, and became pretty well known, just releasing singles and EPs, and they had like 3 different singers before they finally settled on Henry Rollins, and then they released Damaged in 81, but then had this major sort of fallout fight with their label, and because of that they weren't able to release any music for like 3 years, but they kept making music. And so then when that sort of moratorium on releasing stuff ended in 1984, they had this backup of like a bunch of records to put out, and then they released like 4 or 5 records in 2 years and then broke up like immediately. And so part of why they broke up is because you've got these 2 major creative forces with Greg Ginn and Henry Rollins, and they started both moving in very different directions, and neither direction was particularly interested in continuing to do hardcore, which was the style that they were initially known for. And so this record, they've moved very far away from it. It says here at the bottom that it is a spoken word / instrumental record, and that it is. The first side of the record features primarily spoken word pieces by Henry Rollins, and then the B-side features instrumental compositions by Greg Ginn, performed by the full band, that are much more influenced by jazz and than punk, but it's this sort of interesting fusion between the 2 genres. It's very interesting, and there's we got a 9-minute track on here, and we've also got like 50-second spoken word tracks, kind of all over the place. The opening track, the opening self-titled spoken word track, Family Man, really great. I love that track, and I think it really typifies Henry Rollins' sort of vibe from back in the day. Henry Rollins nowadays, he's kind of a boomer, and I'm kind of over it, but 37 years ago he was a pretty cool guy, it seems. Yeah, this is definitely not where you want to start with Black Flag. This is like a deep cut. I do think it's interesting to listen to Black Flag's albums like in progression. If you pick up the compilation, the first 4 years, which is just a compilation of all of their singles and EPs from their first 4 years, start there and then go to Damaged and keep going from there. Listen to the way their sound evolves. I think you'll get a really good understanding of why they are so influential in the world of punk rock and DIY. Yeah.
Yeah.
Smoking all that shit. No place to go. Bottomless heart. So big that everything just gets lost in there. If it never comes out, that's okay by me.
Let's do one more. Next up is one of the most significant albums of my early adolescence. It's The Moon and Antarctica by Modest Mouse from the year 2000. So this was the third LP by Modest Mouse and their major label debut. They didn't hit the big time with this one. That would come with the follow-up 4 years later, Good News for People Who Love Bad News. which had, of course, the song Float On it, which was a massive, massive success. Almost similarly to Butthole Surfers, where, 10 years into their career with these, 3 classic records of the underground under their belt, and they break out in a way that could be categorized as a one-hit wonder almost, if not for the, enduring legacy of the things that came before it. And so when that record came out, I would have been in 8th grade, 9th grade, maybe, middle school. I went to junior high, which was 7th to 9th grade. And I liked that record a lot, but then I had a friend who was like, oh man, you have to listen to the one from before it, Moon in Antarctica, it's so much better. And I did, and it fucked my whole shit up completely. And I became a very big fan of Modest Mouse. And my favorite Modest Mouse album is the one that's from before this one, Lonesome Crowded West. But this one is a very close second place for me. Their debut, This Is a Long Drive for Someone with Nothing to Talk About, is also amazing. And Good News for People Who Have Bad News is, maybe not as well loved as those first 3, but I love that album too as well. And then the things they did after that I have not thought were very good. But, this is like, these guys are titans in the world of indie rock. Very typifying of the sound. This album has a lot more sort of sonic experimentation than some of their earlier stuff did, maybe a little bit. And it's a big, fat. They were making these big, expansive, epic, double records. All of their first 3 records are over an hour long, I'm pretty sure. It's just some of the Isaac Brock is such a incredible songwriter, has really fantastic lyrics, and he also just is able to construct songs in a way that they're a basic guitar, bass, drums band, maybe a little bit of extra here and there, maybe a keyboard here and there, or a steel guitar or a banjo occasionally. The Good News record has a lot of banjo on it, but they sound so much bigger and more epic and larger than life, even though they're just a simple sort of 4-piece rock band instrumentation. And this record has some of the best songs that Isaac ever wrote. Third Planet, I Came as a Rat, Lives, Life Like Weeds. This is just this is a stone cold classic, I think. Probably the best entry point for Modest Mouse as well, I would say, because it found them at this sort of crossroads between their earlier, more stripped back style, and then the later, more pop style. This is sort of the splitting it down the middle, and it works really well. So, yeah, this is great.
Well, I ain't sure, but I've been told it's baking cakes inside our souls. Stayed awake, took a nap, got myself, my body's back. I'm breaking them out on the street, walking around my own bare feet. I do not need you to tell me that I'm not a cat. I caught a ride, he caught some air, he's never gonna cut his hair. It takes more time to make it fake. We now swam down in the lake, then washed the dirt off our intentions, prattled on about bad inventions. I came as ice, I came as a whore, I came as advice that came too short. I came as gold, I came as crap, I came clean and I came as a rat. It takes a long time, but God dies too, but not before he'll stick to you. I don't don't know, but I've been told you'll never die and you never grow old.
All right. I hope that was enjoyable. Maybe you found a record that you've never heard before, or heard me say something mildly interesting about a record you have heard of before from a obscure independent rock band like Pink Floyd or the Beatles. Yeah, thanks for watching.